Alright guys, so we're going to take a look here at number 23 from our midterm exam. Here is the problem itself. It just says that we need to perform the operation, and we are subtracting two fractions here, 19 over 30 minus 56 over 75. So the operation that we are performing on our two fractions is subtraction. And keep in mind that if you are adding or subtracting two fractions, you need to obtain a common denominator first, right? In order to add or subtract fractions, you must have a common denominator. So the question becomes, how do we find this common denominator? Well, if you remember, guys, you can find a common denominator by finding the LCM of your denominators. Remember, the LCM is the least common multiple. All right, so for this particular problem here, we only have two fractions, which means we're only going to be concerned with these two denominators. All right, but let's say you were adding or subtracting more fractions, it just kept going and going and going. You would then just need to look at all of the denominators, right? So you always want to make sure that you're accounting for all of our denominators. In this case, we only need to be concerned with two denominators. So, least common multiple between 30 and 75. Remember that a good idea or a good strategy of finding the least common multiple is to first pick the larger of the two denominators. In our case, that's going to be 75. And we're just going to go through the multiples of 75. All right, so obviously, since we're going through a list of multiples of 75, we know that these are all going to be multiples of 75. All right, but each time we find a multiple of 75, we'll also check and see if it's a multiple of 30. All right, so the very first one that we get to that is also a multiple of 30, that's going to be our least common multiple. So starting with our very first multiple of 75, that's just going to be 75 times 1. 75 times 1 is 75. So is 75 a multiple of 30? Well, some of us might know right off the top of our heads that it's not, but remember, you can always check with a calculator, and you can take that multiple, in this case 75, and divide it by 30. Now, what are we going to be looking for here is the question when we get our answer. Well, what we're going to be looking for is whether or not we get a whole number as our answer. Right? If you do have a whole number, that tells you that 75 is in fact a multiple of 30. If you get some sort of decimal, that tells you that it is not a multiple. And when we hit equals here, we see that that is 2.5. So this is a decimal, it's not a whole number, which means nope, 75 is not a multiple of 30. So let's move to the next multiple of 75, and that would be 75 times 2. So 75 times 2 is 150. We'll confirm that here on the calculator. All right, so 150 is a multiple of 75. Is 150 a multiple of 30? So remember, once again, we would have to take this value of 150 and divide it by 30. Now, if we get a whole number, 30 is a multiple. If it's a fraction, or excuse me, if it's a decimal, then we know that it is not. So when we hit equals here, we see that we do in fact get 5, which is a whole number, which tells us that 150 is a multiple of 30 as well. So that's good news, because that tells us that we've already found our LCM. All right, so the least common multiple between these two numbers we saw was the second multiple of our largest denominator, 75. 75 times 2 was 150. So we know that this is our least common multiple. So we know that that is going to be the common denominator that we are trying to obtain here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to rewrite our original problem. So we have 19 over 30 minus 56 all over 75. All right. So now, let's concentrate on this fraction over here to the left. We have a denominator of 30. We want a denominator of 150. What number do you have to multiply 30 by to get 150? Well, if you remember, we saw that 30 times 5 was 150. All right, but remember, we can't just multiply this denominator by 30 and not multiply the numerator by anything, because that's going to change the value of our fraction. If we multiply our denominator by 5, we also need to multiply our numerator by 5. Why is this a legal move? Why are we allowed to do that? Well, what is that equal to? That's just 1, right? 5 over 5 is just 1. All right, and if you multiply anything by 1, are you changing its value? No, anything times 1 is just itself. So that's why this is a legal move. That's why we're allowed to do this, because you're just multiplying by 1, which does not change the value of the fraction. All right, we can perform the exact same idea over here on the right-hand side. We currently have a denominator of 75. We want a denominator of 150. So we need to take 75 and we need to multiply it by 2 in order to get 150. All right, well, if you're going to multiply your denominator here by 2, you also have to multiply your numerator here by 2. So looking at that orange fraction and just thinking, what are we multiplying our original fraction by here? Right, this right here is just 1. You're just multiplying it by 1. So you're not changing the value of that original fraction. All right, so let's now go ahead and rewrite our fractions after we do our multiplication. We'll get out our calculator, make sure we don't make any errors. So multiplying fractions, you just multiply straight across. Numerator times numerator is 5 times 19. That's equal to 95. All divided by denominator times denominator. And in the end, if you remember, we don't really need to do this multiplication or put it in our calculator, because the whole point of this was to get a common denominator of 150. But just so we can see, 5 times 30 is in fact 150. We are subtracting. We have 56 times 2. I believe that's going to be 112. So 56 times 2 is 112. And once again, our common denominator, the whole point of this process was to get a common denominator of 150. Just to confirm, denominator times denominator, 75 times 2 is 150. Okay. So these two fractions that we see down here, all right, they are the exact same fractions that we had up here in the very beginning. They just appear a little bit different, right? This fraction here is going to be enlarged. Both of the pieces here, the numerator and the denominator, were enlarged by a factor of 5, and both of these pieces here were enlarged by a factor of 2. But you can see that they are in fact the same fractions by just doing a little bit of division. Let's take a look at this first fraction, 19 over 30. 19 over 30. What is that equal to as a decimal? That's 0.63 repeating. What about 95 over 150? We better get the same thing. 95 all over 150. And you see you get 0.63 repeating. So this fraction here and this fraction here, it's the exact same thing, just like we wanted it to be, right? We're not trying to change the problem at all. We're just trying to get numbers that are more useful to us. So now we're finally ready to subtract our two fractions. So we have 95 over 150 minus 112 over 150. We have our common denominator, and remember, anytime you add or subtract fractions, that common denominator is going to stay in your answer. The only thing you add or subtract is your numerators. So we are subtracting in this problem, and we are subtracting the first numerator of 95 minus the second numerator of 112. And we get a negative 17. So we'll throw our negative sign out in front here and put 17 in our numerator. So this is our final answer.